Now, in February 1980, the television comedy Yes Minister, written by Tony Jay and Jonathan Lynn, was first broadcast. Now, a quarter of a century on, the former Conservative Party leader William Hague takes a look back at the series to find out just how true to life it was.
25 years ago this week, one of the most fundamentally important elections of British politics took place.
David Lloyd Evans.
And here at Birmingham East, the returning officer is just declaring the result.
George Hacker, 21,793. Arthur William Gaunt, 19,000.
So Jim Hacker's back with an increased majority, and after many years as a shadow minister, seems almost certain to get a post in the new government.
Of course, it didn't actually happen in real life, but it brought to our television screens the Machiavellian Sir Humphrey, the bumbling Jim Hacker, and exposed Whitehall for the farce that just sometimes is Yes Minister.
Minister, allow me to present Sir Humphrey Appleby, Permanent Under Secretary of State and Head of the DAA.
Hello, Sir Humphrey.
Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Sir Humphrey.
I believe you know each other.
Yes, we did cross swords when the Minister gave me a grilling over the estimates in the Public Accounts Committee
I
last
wouldn't
year.
say that.
Well, you came up with all the questions I hoped nobody would ask.
Well, opposition's about asking awkward questions.
And government is about not answering them.
Well, you answer all mine anyway.
I'm glad you thought so, Minister.
It's 25 years since that first episode was broadcast in February 1980. How did politicians and civil servants regard the programme at the time? And how true to life was it? This week I'll be looking at reaction to Yes Minister. And then next time I'll be exploring specific events from the show that actually happened in real life, either beforehand or subsequently. So now let's explore Yes Minister, the view from Whitehall.
Well, I loved it from the start. I think everybody in Whitehall did. It was very difficult to get anybody to do anything in Whitehall, have any meetings or any evening engagements on the nights when it was being shown.
The extraordinary thing about Yes Minister, which I felt from the first broadcast, is how true it is to life. Of course it's a satire, but it's the best sort of satire in which the incidents actually have occurred, some of them quite literally in my lifetime.
They make a point in each of the episodes, but it's really trying to put into an entertainment and enjoyable context quite serious issues about how you deal with very difficult questions.
Former Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Roy Hattersley, and former Home Secretary, David Blunkett, there. But the voice that told you that you couldn't get anyone in Whitehall to work on the evenings Yes Minister was on the box was the former Cabinet Secretary, Robin Butler. Little did the BBC know when it created Yes Minister that once a week it paralysed the heart of the British state. That was true even at the height of the Arms to Iraq scandal, and the publication of Sir Richard Scott's report that almost brought the government of which I was a member to its knees. Lord Butler recalls that he and William Waldegrave, the cabinet minister at the heart of the affair, were dispatched to write the government's response the evening before the report's publication. This they did, sent it off to be typed, and then waited while the secretaries got to work.
To pass the time, we said, let's see what's on the television. And the BBC, no doubt not accidentally, had chosen to show an episode called The Arms Inquiry. Now, this episode was filmed even before the Iran-Iraq war, so it couldn't possibly have related to it. But nonetheless, it had wonderful truths for this situation. And one part of the episode was where Jim Hacker says to Sir Humphrey, well, we must set up an inquiry into the export of these arms. And Sir Humphrey said,
no, Minister, I beg you. A basic rule of government is never look into anything you don't have to. And never set up an inquiry unless you know in advance what its findings will be.
William and I looked at this. It was a dramatic moment in William's career where his political life hung by a thread, and we laughed until tears rolled down our cheeks.
There were 21 episodes of Yes Minister between 1980 and 1982. The elevation of Jim Hacker to the premiership in a Christmas special in 1984 then led to a further 16 episodes of Yes Prime Minister. Each programme played out the battles between the indecisive minister, Jim Hacker, and his scheming permanent secretary, Sir Humphrey Appleby. But how did these storylines develop? Sir Anthony Jay co-wrote the series.
Our storylines began with looking for areas that threw the civil service and the politicians into conflict, because it's conflict that creates the possibilities of comedy, or indeed drama and tragedy. The honours list, the civil service honours was one of them, and pay for the civil service is another. Most of our research was initially done by talking to people, particularly the sort of people who knew from the inside and were prepared to talk, and that was mostly the people who were advisors and things like that, who weren't terribly discreet.
One of the people who did talk was Bernard Donahue, the head of the Downing Street Policy Unit for Harold Wilson and James Callaghan in the 1970s. As someone at the heart of government, he knew all too well about the disputes between ministers and their officials. He became an invaluable source to Tony Jay and his co-writer Jonathan Lynn.
We lunched regularly. I would talk about my experiences in Number 10. I was aware of which of the experiences might be better adaptable to a plot than others, so I told them various stories, and as I talked, they scribbled. Then, a little while afterwards, they sent me a script based on it, and I was always astonished at what they had added and how they had elaborated it, but not in a misleading way, and how they had introduced very valid comments on the political process.
Civil servants at the time sensed that the earlier programmes had been based on historic events from previous Labour governments. However, the series kept up to speed with Whitehall events. Lord Butler was principal private secretary to Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister at the time.
As the series wore on through Yes, Prime Minister, I think that these sources became more and more current and up to date. And I recognised the same episodes coming round from real life, because, of course, every year there is a problem about teachers' pay, or there's perennial problems about presentation.
It is true that the writers did find a more contemporary source, as I can reveal now. Ken Clarke was a cabinet minister at the time.
Anthony Jay came to see me once to discuss possible storylines and to get my reactions to it, and I think it was part of his research as a scriptwriter. I can't remember whether I gave him any brilliant ideas. I was probably very, very cautious about the endless situations that I'd been involved in, which certainly would have made the basis for a Yes Minister script.
But did Ken Clarke help in any other ways?
People sometimes say that I was the origin of a character in a scene of the smoking Minister of Health. And I have seen one or two that were remarkably similar to the exchanges I was having with my own officials. The authenticity was based on the language. Anthony Jay and his colleague had a feel for the way in which the more old-fashioned civil servants behaved. And as I'm now a bit of a veteran, so I first was a minister back in the Ice Age, in the old days, permanent secretaries and the old deputy secretaries certainly used to speak to their ministers in Mandarin and get extremely devious when you were trying to get them to do things that they didn't want to do, in a way that was remarkably close to the scripts of Yes Minister.
Is that really fair on the civil service? Was real life actually like that? Sir Michael Bishard is a former permanent secretary at the Education Department.
I think the series was quite true to life, and I think, like any good comedy, what it does is just slightly exaggerate the characteristics and sometimes the faults of the civil service. Not too far, but just slightly, and that's what makes it amusing. So, for example, I think the civil service does sometimes put process ahead of outcomes. The elegance of the process is what really matters. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. And Yes Minister gently poked fun at that.
What's the Foreign Office worried about then, Dick? Haven't you got the Foreign Secretary eating out of your hand?
Oh, yes, completely, House Tray.
So what's the problem?
The Prime Minister's the problem. He's starting to mistrust our advice when the Foreign Secretary gives it to him. He's even beginning to question Foreign Office policy.
Surely not.
We even see a danger of the Cabinet pursuing its own foreign policy.
But that's absurd. The country can't have two foreign policies.
Yes Minister suggested that civil servants had their own agendas and their own policies, which sometimes were not the same as those of the Minister. So what would those agendas be? Perhaps my old friend Norman Tebbit can shed some light on it.
Government departments basically exist because they represent or advance the interest of some interest group. The Department of Industry is obvious, the old Department of Agriculture advancing the interest of farmers, obviously. When I went to the Department of Employment, they really rather thought they represented the TUC. And you go to the Foreign Office and you find they represent foreigners.
The Foreign Office represent foreigners? Surely not. Liz Simons used to be the General Secretary of the 1st Division Association, the union of senior civil servants. Now, as a Labour peer, she is herself a Foreign Office minister.
When I first became a minister, I remember going through the policy about a particular country and saying that I thought that this policy should change, and I thought there were various ways in which this could be addressed. And I ended up by saying that I myself proposed to visit this country very soon. There was stunned silence from the civil servants who were in the room with me at the time. And then one of them said, "But Minister, that's not Foreign Office policy." And you suddenly realise that there was a view amongst civil servants about what Foreign Office policy was, which went on irrespective of the government of the day.
Apparently, this isn't just a problem in the Foreign Office. The same is true of domestic departments.
I found that when I went into the Home Office in particular, there was a Home Office tradition, there was a Home Office policy.
So what is that Home Office policy? Perhaps Norman can help again.
The Home Office represents criminals and the police, so it's got perpetual schizophrenia, and one lives in that world.
Thank you, Norman. Now back to David Blunkett.
And it did take a little time to ensure that everyone knew that the policy of the department, and therefore the policy of the government, was the policy of the minister. But it's inevitable, really. I mean, permanent secretaries are permanent. There has to be continuity. They serve governments of all persuasions. We don't have the American system. So there is a helpful continuance and continuity, but it also means, of course, that things are carried from one Secretary of State to another, from one administration to another.
Sir Michael Bishard was David Blunkett's first permanent secretary at the Education Department when Labour entered government in 1997.
The way in which the programme suggests that there are sometimes departmental agendas, and that sometimes, just sometimes, permanent secretaries have their own agendas, that is very observant, and actually, more seriously, is something which concern me. There have been examples over the last 20 or 30 years when particular departments have certainly had their own agenda and have sought to promote that in the face of quite strong opposition from ministers. I think more broadly than that, there's a question about whether sometimes the civil service or some civil servants think that they have access to a set of values which are somehow superior to the values which politicians have. And I think that comes through gently, but it comes through in Yes Minister.
So the show may have captured the mood of government well. But are there events that politicians look at and think, that is so right, it's happened to me? Hello? Yes? Sorry, do you mind? I'm expecting quite an important call. Sorry about that. The first episode of Yes Minister captured only too well the anxiety that every politician goes through after there has been an election or when they know there is going to be a reshuffle. You are hooked by the telephone, waiting for that call from number 10. And that call, and only that call, is the most important thing in your life.
Hello, yes, speaking. Oh, it's you, Michael. No, I haven't had a call. Have you had a call? Bill's had a call. What's he got? Europe?
Waiting by the telephone for the call that may not come is one of those familiar things that afflicts the life of every politician. When Margaret got in 1979, I wasn't sitting by the telephone literally, although I was often told people are. But certainly, there was no call the first day, and some of my mates' names were appearing in the newspapers, and the second day there was no call, and I was one of the last appointed, and I would be less than human if I did not admit that, having been on the front bench in opposition, I was getting seriously concerned that this may be a defining moment in my career.
You answer the bloody thing.
Hello? Mrs. Hacker speaking. Oh, congratulations, Prime Minister. It's Annie here.
Perhaps the episode which impressed me most was the first one in which the new minister is waiting to become a minister. And I have lived through that. I've sat by a telephone hoping for the Prime Minister phone. I've had my friends phone me to see if the Prime Minister's phoned. I've been infuriated by them in case they blocked the line and the Prime Minister said, if Hatters is not prepared to take the call, I won't appoint him. And I've also turned up at the new ministry with my political assistant, who was no more welcomed in the department than Hacker's political assistant was welcome when he arrived.
But this is the waiting room.
Precisely, sir.
But I'm Jim Hacker's special advisor. The Minister now has a whole department to advise him, sir. Look, he needs me.
Yeah, of course he does, sir, but until the Minister sends for you, would you be so good as to wait?
It would be nice to think that political advisers, when they came into government, were welcomed as allies and friends by their civil service. In fact, of course, they hate each other.
Tony J.
The more they can do to keep political advisers out of the way, because political advisers can point out issues and dangers that jeopardise a perfectly sound policy.
Humphrey, Frank has got to have an office of his own in the department.
Certainly, Minister, if you insist.
I do insist.
Well, I do think we have some spare office space in Walthamstow, don't we, Bernard?
I remember saying that I thought that was a bit far-fetched to a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Defence.
Lord Butler.
He said that they tried to put one of their special advisers in the Adelphi or somewhere miles from the central building.
Trying to get the use of the room could be quite tricky. I suspect that the scriptwriters got that from some minister. I don't think they did from me. I can remember at least two examples, one involving the Prime Minister's special advisor and one involving mine, where the problem of which room they were going to use did actually become relevant.
But not every minister agrees with Ken Clarke about the portrayal of political advisers in Yes Minister. Baroness Simons explains.
That is something it didn't get quite right. I'm afraid I belong to the school of thought that thinks that actually where this relationship works, it works extremely well. And my own view, controversial though it may be, is that actually we need more of them rather than fewer of them. Now, I should say that I am married to a political advisor, so perhaps I have a particular take on this.
I have to say that I completely disagree with Lady Simons. I'm on the side of the civil service. Although I did marry my private secretary. One of the things the series got right was the relationship between a minister and his government driver. They are the one civil servant who might stay with you through your ministerial career as you move between departments. My driver, Bert, was so invaluable to me that when I became leader of the opposition, I took him with me for another 4 years. Government drivers become good friends to their ministers and are one of the best sources of information about what is really going on in Whitehall.
It was particularly important in reshuffles. The ministerial drivers always knew the reshuffle was coming. Your own driver usually knew whether you were involved. So it was always reassuring when suddenly the summons came to go to number 10 to have your driver say, don't worry, sir, I think it's going to be all right. And no doubt some people got driven to number 10 saying, I think you may be in a little difficulty, yes, sir, Minister.
We do know that Douglas Jay, when he was sacked from President of the Board of Trade, was told by his driver the day before that he got the sack. And this was because the news had percolated down to the driver's room, talking to the driver about who he would take on after Douglas Jay.
So if the general tone was true to life, what about the characters? Tony J.
A lot of people have asked us if we were basing our Jim and Humphrey on particular characters, and the answer is no. In fact, at the basis of everything is not a particular personality one way or the other, but a basic reflection of the hopes and fears, the punishments and rewards of life at the top of government.
Yes, I mean, no, yes, I mean, well, definitely not, no, yes, I mean, no.
So what did the civil service think of Paul Eddington's portrayal of the minister, Jim Hacker? Michael Bishard explains.
I think as far as Hacker is concerned, what the programme did really well was to encapsulate in one person the various pressures that every politician faces. For example, the politician that wants to make a difference and add value, the politician who's concerned about how his constituency is regarding him, the politician who's concerned about his career and how that's developing.
And do any real politicians empathise with Jim Hacker?
I have been a comparatively lowly cabinet minister. I've faced many of the problems he faced, and I've certainly faced the uncertainties and doubts, the self-doubts, than I think anybody at the bottom of the cabinet list is likely to face. I identified with his nerves. I identified with his mistakes.
Roy Hattersley. But what about Norman Tebbit?
I suspect that from time to time one could find hackers in this world. I think we mostly got rid of them as fast as we could. But I think the programme was a caricature, but a brilliant caricature. And sometimes, if you were sitting there, perhaps just a little bit uncomfortably close to the truth.
So was Nigel Hawthorne's portrayal of the Permanent Secretary, Sir Humphrey Appleby, fair?
Well, it's clear that the committee has agreed that your new policy is really an excellent plan, but in view of some of the doubts being expressed, may I propose that I record that after careful consideration, the considered view of the committee was that while they considered that the proposal met with broad approval in principle, that some of the principles were sufficiently fundamental in principle, and some of the considerations so complex and finely balanced in practice, that in principle it was proposed that the sensible and prudent practice would be to submit the proposal for more detailed consideration, laying stress on the essential continuity of the new proposal with existing principles, and the principal arguments which the proposer proposes and propounds for their approval, in principle.
Without naming names, there certainly were the odd permanent secretaries who were as difficult to deal with as Sir Humphrey, but will behave in the same courteous and Delphic and roundabout way in trying to make sure that what they thought we were rather impetuous and ill-thought-through ideas were not pursued with too much vigour.
I can empathise with Ken Clarke about that, but does Robin Butler?
I don't think that civil servants behave like Sir Humphrey habitually. There are certain tactics, certain ways of talking to ministers that the series captured very well. Civil servants want to be polite to ministers, and so it rings true with me when Sir Humphrey says of some particularly crazy idea that Jim Hacker has, well, that would be a very courageous decision, Minister. One can recognise civil servants using that sort of language, but I certainly don't think that civil servants are as Machiavellian and as conspiratorial as Sir Humphrey comes across.
But how concerned was the civil service about the implication that permanent secretaries were all like Sir Humphrey? I can reveal that meetings took place at the highest levels. Robert Armstrong was Britain's top civil servant at the time as Secretary to the Cabinet.
It was a subject which we did try to discuss. There was nothing we could do about it very much. I think on the whole, the permanent secretaries at that time, we did feel that the portrayal, certainly of Appleby and also of Hacker, was distorted, and that was probably not good for the image of the civil service.
So has anything changed since?
There's still hanging around Whitehall some of the Mandarin language. I give a rather topical and political example. Lord Butler's report on his investigations into the background of Iraq was one of the most damning criticisms of the workings of government I have ever read. But you did have to understand Mandarin to realise this was total condemnation. The polite language was meant to reinforce the savageness of the criticisms, and because it was in such tremendously diplomatic tones, I'm afraid my old friend Robin Butler's criticisms rather lacked force.
So the question we all want answered is, has anyone actually worked with Sir Humphrey? Baroness Simons, maybe?
Yes. I trust you're not going to press me further on that point, as I am a serving minister.
And Lord Armstrong is determined it isn't him.
I have to deny indignantly that I was the model for Sir Humphrey, and I know this to be so because Anthony Jay gave me a copy of the book of the first series of the programme, and he'd written in the front of it, "To Sir Arnold Robin," crossed out Sir Robert Armstrong. So I knew that I was not Sir Humphrey Appleby, but perhaps there was something in common between me and the Secretary of the Cabinet in the first series, our initials in reverse.
The programme quickly became a success, gaining audiences of up to 9 million viewers, with high appreciation figures too. But what was the reaction of the Westminster village? Tony J.
quite early, articles started to appear which did exactly what we wanted to, which was to confirm the authenticity and accuracy, because an enormous amount of what we invested in the programme, we invested in to make it as authentic and as accurate as we possibly could. And more and more, as the first series went on, people suddenly realised they were getting the other side of politics, the side they weren't being shown, the side that happened off the screen. And because we did a lot of research in order to make it credible, the press and the media generally reinforced this.
The programme even made it into the inner working of government, as Robin Butler and Robert Armstrong explain.
Well, I discussed it a lot with Margaret Thatcher because it was well known, one of her favourite programmes.
We used to joke about it. She got the videos in for Christmas one time and had a kind of session watching them all. She did enjoy it very much.
Margaret Thatcher often used to say to me when we were having an argument, "This is like something out of Yes Minister."
And the programme's #1 fan did assist the writers.
When the series graduated from Yes Minister to Yes Prime Minister, she asked me to show Tony J and Jonathan Lynn round number 10 so that they could see the settings. And I did that and took them through to the Cabinet Secretary's room, Sir Humphrey's room, and they reproduced all these settings so exactly that you could believe you were in the rooms. Indeed, I remember one occasion when Nigel Hawthorne was doing Down Your Way, and I was Cabinet Secretary, and he came to interview me in the Cabinet Secretary's room.
There comes a moment in every Whitehall farce where the imposter is confronted by the real thing, so it won't surprise anybody to hear that I'm now sitting opposite the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robin Butler.
And seeing him in that room, I had an identity crisis. I wasn't really quite sure whether he was the real thing or I was.
So 25 years on, what is the legacy of Yes Minister? My old friends Robin Butler and, firstly, Ken Clarke.
I've always said that it's far too close to life to be safely shown to the public. 20 years ago, the conduct of business did have that atmosphere. Things you proposed that the civil servants agreed with would be expedited extremely rapidly. Things you proposed that your permanent secretary didn't actually agree with would run into difficulties and take a very great deal of time, and you had to keep checking that anything had actually happened.
I always recommend that people should take out these series and look at them as one of the best political textbooks about the British system that they can read.
And for the future, Norman Tebbit has an idea.
Someone will have to do a series called Yes Commissioner, although they'll probably find their offices are bugged and broken into, things like that, by the Commission if they went so far as to do that.
It's clear that Yes Minister holds a deep affection close to the hearts of most politicians and civil servants. But whether that affection is because of its comic genius or its credibility and authenticity is a question no one can answer.
Yes, Prime Minister.
No, Sir Humphrey. Well, not this week, anyway.
William Hague returns next Saturday morning with the conclusion of Yes Minister, The View from Whitehall. The producer was Anthony Worrell. And you might like to know that you can hear the radio versions of Yes Minister over on one of the BBC's digital radio stations, BBC 7. It's on Wednesday afternoons at 2:30.